Sometimes the hardest journey a man can take is back through his own past. For 67-year-old Walt Hanley, buying a forgotten barn on the edge of town wasn't about fixing up old wood. It was about fixing something broken deep inside himself. The barn had stood empty for 40 years, rotting under open sky, avoided by everyone who passed. But Walt saw something the town couldn't. His brother disappeared after the war, leaving nothing but questions and grief. When Walt stepped inside that crumbling structure, what he found beneath the dust changed everything he knew about family and secrets. What was hidden in that barn that made an entire town face the truth they'd been running from for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Walt Hanley had been awake since 4:30 that morning, same as every morning for the past 20 years. The ritual never changed. Coffee first, black and strong enough to strip paint. Then out to the stables while the Montana sky was still more black than blue, checking on the 6 horses he boarded for folks who'd moved to town but couldn't quite let go of the animals they'd raised. He moved slower than he used to, his right knee complaining about every step, a souvenir from a bull named Tombstone back in 1985. But he moved with purpose, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what your day requires. Copper Ridge had been dying for 30 years, bleeding population the way a stuck pig bleeds out. Used to be a mining town, then a timber town, then a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. The high school had closed in 2003. The grocery store followed in 2011. Now there was Earl's Gas and General, the Copper Ridge Diner, a post office that opened 3 days a week, and a whole lot of empty buildings with for sale signs that had faded to ghosts. Walt didn't mind the quiet. He'd had enough noise in his younger years to last 2 lifetimes. The diner sat on what used to be Main Street, a brick building with windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Walt took his usual booth in the back corner at 6:30, nodding to Marlene behind the counter. She'd been pouring coffee in this place since before he was born, and she moved through the morning routine with the efficiency of a woman who'd done the same thing 10,000 times. "Usual?" she asked, though she was already writing it down. "Please. 2 eggs over easy, bacon, wheat, toast." Walt had ordered the same breakfast every morning since 1998. Marlene brought the coffee first, filled his cup without asking, and moved on to the only other customer, old Frank Jessup, who sat at the counter reading a newspaper that was 3 days old. The door chimed. Vernon Mills came in, shaking rain off his jacket. Vernon ran the farm equipment business. His daddy had started, though there weren't many farms left to service. He spotted Walt and made his way over, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation. "Heard you bought the Peterson barn," Vernon said. "No hello, no preamble, just straight to business." "That's right. Mind if I ask why?" Walt sipped his coffee. "Seemed like a good idea at the time," Vernon laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Walt, that place has been falling apart since before your daddy passed. Half the roof is gone. Foundation's probably shot, and it's 3 miles out on a road nobody uses anymore. What exactly do you plan to do with it?" "Haven't decided yet." "You paid $12,000 for a pile of rotten splinters." "It's my $12,000. Marlene brought Walt's breakfast and gave Vernon a breakfast look that suggested he should mind his own business. Vernon took the hint, slid out of the booth, and headed to the counter. But Walt could feel the eyes on him. By noon, everyone in Copper Ridge would know about the purchase. By evening, they'd all have theories about whether he'd lost his mind. Let them talk. Walt had stopped caring what people thought around the same time he'd stopped competing in rodeos. That had been another life. From 18 to 39, Walt Hanley had been somebody. Not famous, not nationally ranked, but good enough to make a living on the circuit. Bull riding mostly, though he'd done some bronc work too. He'd traveled from Billings to Tucson to Oklahoma City, sleeping in his truck, living on prize money and adrenaline. His body still carried the evidence of those years. The knee. 3 broken ribs that ached when the weather changed, a collarbone that had been shattered twice, fingers that didn't quite straighten anymore. He'd been good, not great, but good. And for a kid from a nowhere town in Montana, that had been enough. Tommy had been different. 10 years younger, Tommy had been the smart one, the one who'd actually finished high, to school. The one who could have gone to college if their folks had been able to afford it. Instead, Tommy had enlisted in 1968, 18 years old, and convinced he was going to save the world. Walt had been 28 then, still riding, still believing his body would hold together forever. They'd been close, growing up, despite the age gap. Walt had taught Tommy to ride, taught him to rope, taught him all the practical skills their father hadn't had time for. And Tommy had taught Walt to slow down, to notice things. The kid had been an artist, always drawing, always making something with his hands. He'd carved little animals out of scrap wood, whittled them during long summer evenings on the porch. Horses, dogs, eagles. Each one detailed and perfect, smoothed until they felt like silk. The telegram had come in March of 1970. Missing in action, presumed dead. Their mother had collapsed in the kitchen. Their father had read it 3 times without speaking, then walked out to the barn, and didn't come back until morning. Walt had been in Denver when he got the call. He'd driven straight through, 18 hours without stopping, arrived home to find his parents, aged 10 years, in 2 days. They'd buried an empty casket 6 months later when the army declared Tommy officially dead. The chaplain had said nice things. The town had turned out. And then everyone had gone on living, because that's what people do. But Walt had never quite figured out how. He'd kept riding for another 9 years, pushing harder, taking bigger risks, until Tombstone had finally ended it. After that, he'd come home to Copper Ridge, bought a small property on the edge of town, and settled into a life that felt like waiting for something he couldn't name. The Peterson barn sat 3 miles east of town, on what used to be the old Peterson Ranch. Jacob Peterson had raised sheep there in the 50s and 60s, 200 acres of decent grazing land. But Jacob had died in 1982, his kids had moved away, and the property had been sold off piece by piece. The barn was the last remnant, sitting on 5 acres that nobody wanted. It had been through 3 owners since the Petersons, none of whom had done anything with it. The auction had been held at the county office, a formality because there'd been exactly 2 people present. Walt and a developer from Billings who'd taken one look at the survey and walked out. The auctioneer, a bored woman named Sandra, had seemed surprised when Walt raised his hand. "Do you understand the condition of the property?" she'd asked. "I've seen it. No electricity, no water, significant structural damage. I'll take it." She'd shrugged and processed the paperwork. Walt had driven out there the next day, pulling up the overgrown drive in his truck. The barn leaned to the left, its north wall bowed out like a sail catching wind. The roof was more hole than shingle. The doors hung open, one barely attached to its hinges. Inside, it smelled like rot and animal droppings, and 40 years of abandonment. Most people would have seen trash. Walt saw possibility. Or maybe just distraction. Something to fill his days that didn't involve staring at the walls of his house, wondering where all the years had gone. He'd brought a flashlight and work gloves, intending to do a basic survey of what needed fixing. The main floor was concrete, cracked but intact. The loft above had collapsed in sections, leaving debris scattered everywhere. Hay bales had decomposed into mulch, empty feed sacks hung from nails. A rusted pitchfork leaned in one corner. Walt moved carefully, testing each step. His knee wouldn't tolerate him breaking through rotten flooring. He cleared a path through the debris, pulling aside old tarps and broken equipment. In the southwest corner, where the wall met the floor, he found a gap where the boards had separated from the concrete. Something caught his eye, a shape that didn't belong. He knelt down, his knee protesting, and reached into the gap. His fingers closed around something smooth and solid. He pulled it out and held it up to the light, filtering through the broken roof. A wooden horse. Maybe 4 inches tall, carved from what looked like pine. The detail was remarkable. The mane had individual strands, the legs were perfectly proportioned, the eyes seemed to hold something almost alive. Walt's breath caught in his chest. He knew this carving. Knew it the way you know your own face in a mirror. Tommy had made dozens like it, back when they were kids. Walt still had one somewhere in his house, a gift from Tommy, the Christmas before he'd enlisted. This was Tommy's work, no question, but that was impossible. Tommy had never been to this barn. The Petersons had lived on the other side of town from the Hanleys, and Tommy had left for the war in 1968, years before Walt even knew this place existed. Walt turned the horse over in his hands, his mind racing through possibilities. That didn't make sense. The carving wasn't old. The wood was weathered, but not ancient. The edges were still sharp. He looked around the barn with new eyes. If there was one, there might be more. He spent the next hour searching, moving through the debris with renewed purpose. And he found them. 3 more carvings. A dog tucked behind a support beam. A bird wedged in a window frame, a deer lying in a pile of old rope, each one perfect, each one unmistakably Tommy's work. Walt sat down on an overturned bucket, the 4 carvings lined up on the ground in front of him. His hands were shaking. The logical part of his brain said this was coincidence, that someone else had made these, that he was seeing connections that weren't there. But the part of him that had grown up with Tommy, that had watched his brother work for countless hours with a knife and a piece of wood, knew better. Tommy had been here. Somehow, at some point, his brother had been in this barn, and Walt was going to find out why. Walt didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the 4 wooden carvings arranged on his nightstand where he could see them. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy's hands working a piece of wood, saw the concentration on his brother's face, heard his voice explaining how you had to work with the grain, not against it. By the time dawn broke, Walt had made a decision. He wasn't going to mention the carvings to anyone. Not yet. Not until he understood what they meant. The town already thought he was foolish for buying the barn. If he started talking about finding his dead brother's artwork, they'd think he'd lost his mind completely. He loaded his truck with proper equipment, heavy-duty flashlights and battery-powered lanterns, a crowbar, hammer and screwdrivers, work gloves and knee pads, a push broom and trash bags. If he was going to search the barn thoroughly, he needed to do it right. The morning was cold, the kind of early November cold that promised snow before the week was out. Walt drove the 3 miles to the barn with his heater running and his mind churning through questions that had no answers. The dirt road leading to the property was rutted and overgrown, branches scraping the sides of his truck. The barn looked even more decrepit in the grey morning light. Walt parked and sat for a moment, gathering himself. His knee ached, his back complained about yesterday's bending and kneeling. At 67, his body liked to remind him daily that he wasn't young anymore, but this was more important than comfort. He set up the lanterns first, positioning them around the main floor to eliminate shadows. The barn transformed under the steady light, revealing details he'd missed before. Old horseshoes nailed to beams, initials carved in wood, a calendar from 1979 still hanging on one wall, forever stuck on June. Walt started in the corner where he'd found the first horse, working systematically from one side to the other. He moved debris carefully, checking every crevice, every gap between boards. The work was slow and methodical, the kind of patience that comes from years of working with animals that can't be rushed. He found 2 more carvings by mid-morning, a rabbit tucked into a broken toolbox, a fox hidden behind a loose board. Both showed Tommy's distinctive style, the attention to detail that had always set his work apart. Walt photographed each location with his phone before moving the carvings. Some part of him understood that this was evidence, though evidence of what he couldn't yet say. He placed each piece carefully in a cardboard box he'd brought, cushioned with old towels. The floorboards in the center of the barn had buckled and warped over the years, creating gaps where water had gotten in and rot had taken hold. Walt knelt down, ignoring his knee's protest, and examined the damage more closely. Some of the boards were completely compromised, soft enough to push through with. His hand. He started removing the worst sections, prying them up with the crowbar. The work revealed the subfloor beneath, concrete that had cracked but remained mostly intact. He was 3 boards in when his crowbar hit something that wasn't floor. He stopped, cleared away more debris, used his flashlight to peer into the gap. There was a space beneath the boards. Not a basement, just a shallow cavity, maybe 8 inches deep, where the concrete had settled unevenly, creating a pocket between the foundation and the floor above. And something was in it. Walt's hands were steadier now, operating on muscle memory from years of delicate work. He removed 2 more boards, widening the opening. Then he reached down into the cavity, his fingers brushing against fabric. He pulled up a canvas bag, military green and water-stained but intact. It was heavy, filled with something solid. Walt set it aside and reached back down. His fingers found metal. He pulled it up into the light. Dog. Tags. 2 of them on a chain, dulled with age but still readable. Hanley, Thomas J. Serial number. Blood type, O positive. Religion, Protestant. Walt's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing himself to focus. These were Tommy's tags, the actual tags his brother had worn in Vietnam. The tags that should have been returned to the family with his remains or logged as lost if his body was never recovered. But they were here, in a barn in Montana, hidden under floorboards. Walt's mind struggled to process what this meant. When someone died in service, their tags followed specific protocols. One stayed with the body, one went to graves registration. They didn't end up hidden in random buildings in small towns, unless Tommy had put them there himself. The thought hit Walt like a physical blow. He sat back on his heels, the tags dangling from his fingers, and let himself consider what he'd been avoiding since finding the first carving. Tommy had come home. Somehow, despite the telegram and the funeral and the 45 years of believing his brother was dead, Tommy had come home. But if that was true, where had he gone? Why had he hidden these things? And why had he never contacted his family? Walt's father had died in 1995, his mother in 2003. Both had gone to their graves believing Tommy was dead. If he'd been alive, if he'd been here in Montana, why hadn't he told them? The canvas bag sat beside Walt, forgotten in his shock. He picked it up now, loosening the drawstring at the top. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all crammed together. The envelopes were addressed in different hands, different styles. Some were yellowed with age, others looked newer. Walt pulled one out at random. The postmark was dated April 1969. The letter inside was written in his mother's careful script. It started with, "Dear Tommy," and went on for 3 pages, updating him on town news, weather, small details of daily life. Another letter, this one, from November 1969, his father's blocky handwriting, harder to read but full of the same kind of mundane family information. A third from December, written by Walt himself, awkward and stilted because he'd never been good with words on paper. These were the letters they'd sent Tommy during his service. Walt remembered writing some of them, remembered his mother at the kitchen table, composing updates she hoped would reach him wherever he was. After Tommy was declared missing, they'd stopped. What was the point of writing to a dead man? But Tommy had kept them, every single one, had carried them back from wherever he'd been, and hidden them here, along with his tags and his carvings. Walt sat on the dirty floor of the abandoned barn, holding proof that everything he'd believed for 45 years was wrong, and felt something inside him crack open. Not breaking? Exactly. More like a door that had been sealed shut, was suddenly unlocked. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry or rage at the unfairness of it all. His parents had died never knowing. He'd spent half his life grieving a brother who might have been alive. And now, decades too late, he was finding pieces of a puzzle he didn't understand. Walt carefully gathered the tags and the bag of letters. He added them to the box with the carvings. Then he stood, his knee screaming in protest, and looked around the barn with a new understanding. This wasn't just an abandoned building, this was a hiding place, a monument, a message, and Walt was going to read every word of it, no matter how long it took or what truths he had to face. Walt spent the next 3 days at home, reading. He'd brought the box back from the barn and spread its contents across his dining room table. The letters were organized by postmark date, and he worked through them chronologically, reliving months of his family's life through their words. His mother wrote weekly, sometimes twice a week. Her letters were full of small-town news, Mrs. Henderson's new baby, the church potluck, how the garden was coming along. She never mentioned worry or fear, though Walt could read it between the lines. She kept her tone light, optimistic, as if believing that positivity alone could bring Tommy home safe. His father wrote less frequently, usually adding a paragraph or two to his mother's letters. His words were stiffer, more formal, but no less caring. He wrote about the ranch work, about neighbors who'd asked about Tommy, about hoping the weather was better wherever Tommy was stationed. Walt's own letters made him wince. He'd written maybe once a month, brief updates about rodeos and travel. He'd been so caught up in his own life that he'd barely spared thought for what Tommy might be going through. The letters felt shallow now, inadequate. He wished he could go back and write better ones. The last letter in the collection was dated February 1970, 1 month before the telegram. His mother's handwriting, full of plans for Tommy's homecoming. She was already planning a party, already making lists of his favorite foods to cook. That letter destroyed Walt. He had to set it down and walk away, standing at his kitchen window for 20 minutes while he got control of himself. But buried in the stack of family letters, Walt found something else. Other envelopes, addressed to Tommy but from people Walt didn't recognize. He opened one carefully, unfolding paper that was brittle with age. The letter was from someone named Marcus Chen, written from an address in San Francisco. The date was July 1971, more than a year after Tommy was declared dead. The letter was friendly but cautious, asking how Tommy was settling in, whether he'd found work, whether he needed anything. Walt read it 3 times, trying to make sense of the timeline. If Marcus Chen was writing to Tommy in 1971, then Tommy had been alive then, had been somewhere, communicating with people, living a life his family knew nothing about. Another letter, this one from December 1972. A woman named Sarah Peterson, the same surname as the people who'd owned the barn, writing from Copper Ridge. She thanked Tommy for the beautiful carving he'd given her daughter for Christmas. She said he was always welcome for dinner, that they thought of him as family, that he shouldn't be alone for the holidays. Walt's hands shook as he set the letter down. The Petersons. Tommy had known the Petersons, had been close enough to them to make carvings for their children. The same Petersons who'd owned the barn where Walt had found everything. It wasn't coincidence. It was connection. Walt had known Jacob Peterson, though not well. The man had been 20 years older, kept mostly to himself. His wife had died young. He'd had kids, but Walt couldn't remember their names or where they'd ended up. The Peterson place had been sold off when Jacob died in 1982, and Walt had never given it much thought. But now he needed to know everything. The Copper Ridge Library was open 3 days a week, run by Helen Marsh, who'd been the head librarian since before Walt was born. He found her there on Thursday morning, sorting through donated books at the front desk. "Walt Hanley," she said, looking up with surprise. "I don't think I've seen you in here since high school." "Been a while," he admitted. "I need to look at some old records. Newspaper archives, maybe property records if you have them." Helen studied him with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 70 years reading people as well as books. "What are you looking for?" "Information about the Peterson family. Jacob Peterson specifically. The sheep rancher? He's been dead 30 years, Walt." "I know. Just doing some research." She didn't push, which Walt appreciated. She led him to a back room where the library kept microfiche readers and boxes of archived newspapers from the Copper Ridge Gazette. The newspaper had folded in 2008, but before that it had documented every significant event in town for 90 years. "You know how to work these?" Helen asked, gesturing at the ancient microfiche reader. "I'll figure it out." She left him alone. Walt started with 1982, the year Jacob Peterson died. It didn't take long to find the obituary. Jacob was survived by 2 children, Sarah Peterson, Andrews, and Michael Peterson. Sarah had moved to Seattle, Michael to Denver. The funeral had been held at First Presbyterian Church. Walt went back further, scanning through the 70s. The Petersons appeared occasionally in the social pages, church events, school functions. Nothing unusual until Walt reached December 1972 and found a small article buried in the local news section. "Local family takes in veteran." The article was brief, maybe 3 paragraphs. It reported that Jacob and Sarah Peterson were providing housing for a recently returned veteran who wished to remain anonymous. The veteran was recovering from war injuries and would be helping with ranch work while readjusting to civilian life. The article praised the Petersons for their generosity and reminded readers that many veterans needed community support during their transition home. Walt read it 5 times, his heart pounding. The timing matched. December 1972 was when Sarah Peterson had written that letter, thanking Tommy for a carving. And if Tommy had been living with them, that explained why his belongings had ended up in their barn. But it raised more questions than it answered. Why had Tommy needed to remain anonymous? Why hadn't he contacted his own family when he was just a few miles away? And what had happened to him between 1972 and now? Walt made copies of the article and the obituary. He thanked Helen and drove back home, his mind racing through possibilities. That evening, he sat at his dining room table with a legal pad and started making notes. A timeline, names, questions that needed answers. Sarah Peterson Andrews in Seattle, Michael Peterson in Denver. Both might still be alive. Both might know what had happened to Tommy. Walt had spent 45 years believing his brother was dead. He'd accepted it, learned to live with it, built a life around that absence. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by something more painful, hope mixed with confusion and anger. Anger that Tommy had been alive and hadn't reached out, confusion about why, and hope, fragile and dangerous, that maybe there were answers waiting to be found. He picked up his phone and stared at it for a long time before finally setting it down. He wasn't ready yet. Not ready to call strangers and ask about his dead brother who maybe wasn't dead. Not ready to hear whatever truth had been hidden for decades. But he would be. Soon. Walt went back to the barn on Saturday. He'd been avoiding it, overwhelmed by what he'd already found, but he couldn't stay away. If there were more answers hidden in that building, he needed them. This time, he brought a better ladder and a respirator mask. The loft was partially collapsed, but sections remained intact, and Walt had a feeling that if Tommy had hidden things on the ground floor, he might have hidden more above. The ladder creaked under his weight. Walt climbed slowly, testing each rung. The loft smelled like decay and bird droppings. He swept his flashlight beam across the space, looking for anything that didn't belong. In the far corner, beneath a pile of rotted hay bales, he found a wooden crate. It was handmade, rough but sturdy, with rope handles on each side. Walt dragged it out into better light and pried open the lid. Inside were more letters, these ones newer. A journal with a cracked leather cover, and beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth, a photograph in a simple frame. Walt pulled out the photograph first. The image was faded but clear. 5 people stood in front of the barn. This barn, when it had still been whole. Jacob Peterson was easy to identify, tall and stern-faced. Next to him stood a woman Walt assumed was Sarah, maybe 30 years old. 2 children, a boy and a girl, no more than 10 or 12. And beside them, slightly apart but clearly part of the group, stood a man Walt recognized even though he hadn't seen him in 55 years, Tommy, older than he'd been when he enlisted, maybe 25 or 26. thinner than Walt remembered, with a beard and long hair pulled back, but unmistakably Tommy. His eyes had the same look Walt had seen in old photographs of their father, distant, haunted, carrying weight that didn't show anywhere else. Walt sat down hard on a hay bale, still holding the photograph. Here was proof, absolute, undeniable proof that Tommy had come home, had lived in this town, had been part of a family Walt had never known about. He set the photograph aside carefully and picked up the journal. The first entry was dated March 1972. Jacob found me sleeping in the barn yesterday. Instead of calling the sheriff, he brought me breakfast. I haven't decided if he's a fool or a saint. Maybe both. Sarah says I can stay as long as I need. She doesn't ask questions. I'm grateful for that. Walt read on. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart. Tommy wrote about working on the ranch, about the physical labor that helped quiet his mind. He wrote about Sarah's kindness, about her kids who'd taken to following him around. He wrote about carving wood in the evenings, finding peace in creating something beautiful out of nothing. But he also wrote about nightmares, about sounds that made him freeze up, about days when he couldn't leave the barn, couldn't face people, couldn't remember who he was supposed to be. I can't go back to them, one entry read. Can't face Mom and Dad and Walt knowing what I did, what I saw, what I became. They remember Tommy, the kid who carved horses and dreamed about seeing the world. That person is dead. I died in the jungle. The thing that came back isn't worth knowing. Walt had to stop reading. His throat was tight, his eyes burning. He understood now, in a way he wished he didn't. Tommy hadn't stayed away because he didn't love them. He'd stayed away because he loved them too much to let them see what the war had done to him. It was the wrong choice. Walt knew that, could see it clearly from 40 years of distance, but he also understood how a man could convince himself it was the right one, especially a man who'd been broken and was trying to protect the people he cared about from his own wreckage. The journal continued through 1974. The entries grew shorter, less frequent. The last one was dated August 1974, just 3 sentences. Staying is harder than leaving ever was. But Jacob needs help with the harvest. I can give him that much at least. After that, nothing. Walt flipped through the remaining pages, all blank. Whatever had happened to Tommy after August 1974 wasn't recorded here. Walt gathered everything carefully, the photograph, the journal, the letters. He climbed back down the ladder and sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the barn. Tommy had lived here, had worked here, had tried to build some kind of life in the shadow of the one he'd left behind, and then he'd vanished again. The question was where and why, and whether he'd ever found the peace he'd been looking for. Monday morning, Walt was back at the diner. He'd been rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd explain his sudden interest in ancient history. But when he slid into his usual booth, Vernon was already there, sitting across from him like he'd been waiting. "You've been spending a lot of time at that barn," Vernon said without preamble. "It's my barn." "Sure it is, and I'm not trying to pry, but people are noticing. You've been out there every day for a week. You're not eating right. You look like you're not sleeping. And Helen Marsh told me you were digging through old newspapers about the Petersons. Walt should have known better. In a town this small, privacy was a luxury nobody had. Just curious about the property history." Vernon leaned back, studying him with the kind of patient expression that said he wasn't buying it, but wasn't going to push. "Not yet. If you need help with something, you can ask. That's what neighbors do. I'm fine." "Uh-huh." Vernon stood up, dropped a $5 bill on the table for his coffee. "Offer stands. Whatever you're looking for out there, you don't have to look alone." After Vernon left, Marlene came over with the coffee pot. She refilled Walt's cup without asking, then surprised him by sitting down in the booth across from him. "That man worries about you," she said. "We all do. No need. Maybe not, but we're going to anyway." She folded her hands on the table. "I knew your brother. Not well, but enough to remember him. Good kid, Sweet disposition. Everyone was torn up when we heard he wasn't coming home. Walt met her eyes. Did you know the Petersons? Some. Jacob was a quiet man. Sarah was lovely. Shame what happened. What do you mean? She died young. Car accident, maybe 10 years after her mama passed. Jacob raised those kids alone after that. They turned out all right, from what I heard. Walt filed the information away. Sarah was dead. That meant Michael Peterson was his best chance of getting answers. Why are you asking about them? Marlene asked gently. Walt almost told her, almost laid it all out, the carvings, the letters, the photograph. But something held him back. Until he knew the whole story, until he understood what had happened to Tommy and why, he couldn't share it. This was his burden to carry. Just curious, he said. Like I told Vernon. Marlene patted his hand and stood up. You let me know if you need anything. And I mean that. Walt nodded, grateful for her kindness, even as he kept his secrets. He'd call Michael Peterson today. Whatever answers were waiting, he was ready to hear them. Finding Michael Peterson took less time than Walt expected. A simple internet search turned up a phone number in Denver. Walt stared at it for an hour before dialing, rehearsing, and discarding a dozen different opening lines. The phone rang 4 times. Walt was about to hang up when a man answered. Hello? Is this Michael Peterson, son of Jacob Peterson from Copper Ridge, Montana? A pause. Yes. Who's this? My name is Walt Hanley. I bought your father's old barn a few weeks back. I was hoping I could ask you some questions about the property. The barn. God. I didn't know that old thing was still standing. What do you want to know? Walt took a breath. This is going to sound strange, but I found some things hidden there. Letters, carvings, personal items. I think they belong to someone who lived with your family in the early 70s. A veteran. The silence on the other end stretched so long, Walt thought the line had gone dead. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice quieter now. You found Tom's things. Hearing Tommy called Tom by a stranger hit Walt harder than he expected. Tom Hanley. He was my brother. Jesus. Michael let out a long breath. I didn't know he had family in Copper Ridge. He never said he had family. We thought he died in Vietnam. We buried an empty casket in 1970. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I was just a kid, maybe 11, when he came to live with us. I knew he was a veteran, knew he'd been through something terrible, but he never talked about his past. My dad always said we shouldn't ask questions, that Tom would talk when he was ready. How long did he live with you? 2 years, maybe a little more. From late 72 until sometime in 75. I don't remember exactly when he left. Walt gripped the phone tighter. Do you know where he went? No. He just left one day. My dad came back from town, and Tom was gone. Packed up what little he had and disappeared. Dad was upset about it, tried to find him, but it was like he'd never existed. We figured he'd moved on, maybe found some peace somewhere else. Did he ever mention anything about his family? About where he was from? Michael was quiet for a moment. Not to me. But I was young. He talked to my sister more than me. Sarah, we were named after our mother. She died when I was 16, before I could ask her about those years. If Tom told anyone about his past, it would have been her. Another dead end. Walt felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. Did he leave anything behind? Anything that might tell me where he went? Not that I know of. After he left, Dad packed up his room, gave some clothes to the church. But there might be... Michael stopped. Wait, there is something. After Dad died, we cleaned out the house. Found a box in the attic labeled with Tom's name. Sarah wanted to keep it, said if Tom ever came back, he should have his things. After she died, I took it. Never opened it. Didn't feel right. Walt's heart was pounding. Do you still have it? Yeah, it's in my garage. Buried under 30 years of other stuff. But it's there. Would you be willing to send it to me? I'll pay for shipping, whatever it costs. You really want to know what happened to him, don't you? He was my brother. I spent 45 years thinking he was dead. Now I find out he was alive, living 3 miles from my house, and I never knew. I need to understand why. Michael sighed. I'll find the box. Give me your address. Walt rattled it off. They talked for a few more minutes. Michael shared memories of Tom helping with ranch work, teaching Michael how to whittle, staying up late talking with Sarah about books and music. He'd been quiet but kind, Michael said. Patient. Someone who'd seen too much but hadn't let it make him bitter. He carved things, Michael added. Animals, mostly. He gave me a wolf for my birthday once. I still have it. That was his hobby as a kid, Walt said. Before the war, I think it helped him. Gave him something to focus on besides whatever was in his head. Dad used to say Tom's hands needed to stay busy or his mind would wander to bad places. After they hung up, Walt sat at his kitchen table feeling hollowed out. Tommy had been alive for years after the war, had lived, worked, created things, had been known and cared for by people who weren't his blood family. And then he'd left, vanished again, and maybe this time for good. The box arrived 4 days later, delivered by the postal truck that came through town twice a week. Walt signed for it and carried it inside, his hands shaking. The cardboard was old, held together with packing tape that had yellowed. Jacob Peterson had written Tom on the side in black marker, along with the date, November 1975. Walt set it on his dining room table and stared at it for 10 minutes before finding the courage to open it. Inside was a life in miniature, 3 shirts, worn but clean, a pair of work boots, a jacket with the name Tom stitched on the breast, a harmonica, a book of poetry by Robert Frost, pages dog-eared and spine cracked from reading, and, at the bottom, wrapped in an old T-shirt, another wooden carving. This one was different from the others, larger, more ambitious. It showed 2 figures, a man and a boy, sitting on a fence. The detail was extraordinary. You could see the wood grain in the fence posts, the texture of their clothes, the expressions on their faces. The man had his hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy was holding something small, maybe a carving of his own. There was a note tucked under the carving, written in handwriting Walt didn't recognize. Jacob Peterson's, he guessed. Tom left this behind. I think he meant it as a thank you, but I always felt it was something more. A memory, maybe, or a wish for something he'd lost. I kept it because it seemed wrong to let it go. If you're reading this, I hope you understand what he was trying to say. J. P. Walt turned the carving over in his hands. The figures could be anyone, father and son, brothers, friends, but Walt knew who they were meant to be, could see it in the way they sat, in the intimacy of the pose. It was him and Tommy, the way they'd been before the war, before everything changed, when they were just brothers sitting on a fence, and the future was something bright instead of something that took people away. Walt set the carving down carefully. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them. Let the tears come. Let himself feel the loss and the love and the terrible unfairness of having found his brother's ghost, but not his brother. Tommy had remembered, had carved this memory into wood and left it behind. That meant something. Meant that whatever hell he'd been living in, some part of him had still held on to the good things. The question was whether that part had been strong enough to save him, or if he'd disappeared because it wasn't. Walt spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions of his daily routine while his mind stayed stuck on Tommy. He fed the horses. He drove to the diner. He smiled when people spoke to him, but he wasn't really there. Vernon showed up at his place on a Saturday afternoon, unannounced. Walt was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when Vernon's truck pulled up. "You look like hell," Vernon said without preamble. "Good to see you too." Vernon leaned against the barn door, arms crossed. "I've known you 35 years, Walt. I know when something's eating at you. And whatever this is, it's bigger than curiosity about an old barn." Walt kept shoveling. His knee was screaming, but the physical work helped clear his head. "It's personal. Everything's personal in a town this size. Doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." Walt stopped working. He looked at Vernon, saw genuine concern on his face, and made a decision. He'd been carrying this alone for weeks now, and it was getting heavier. Maybe sharing the weight would help. Or maybe it would just make it real in a way he wasn't ready for. Either way, he couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. "You remember my brother?" Walt asked. "Tommy?" "Sure. He left for Vietnam in '68, never came back. Terrible thing. That's what I thought too. Turns out we were wrong." Vernon's expression didn't change. He just waited, patient as always. Walt told him everything. The carvings, the letters, the photograph, the conversation with Michael Peterson. Vernon listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious as the story unfolded. When Walt finished, Vernon was quiet for a long moment. "So Tommy came home, lived with the Petersons for 2 years, then vanished again. That's what it looks like. And you want to know where he went? I need to know. Need to understand why he couldn't come to us, why he disappeared instead of..." Walt's voice caught. "Our parents died thinking he was gone. If I can find out what happened to him, maybe I can make some kind of sense of it." Vernon pushed off from the door. "What do you need?" "I don't know. I've hit a wall. Michael Peterson doesn't know where Tommy went. There's nothing in the letters or journal after 1974. It's like he just erased himself. Did you check with the VA? Maybe he got help there, left a trail." Tommy wasn't officially alive. As far as the military was concerned, he was still missing in action. "I don't think he would have risked going to the VA and exposing himself." Vernon thought for a moment. "What about the sheriff's office? Old records, missing person reports, anything like that?" "I hadn't thought of that. Worth checking. Herb Collins was sheriff back then. He retired in '95, died a few years after. But the records should still be there. And Julie Brennan runs the office. Now she's thorough, might be willing to help." Walt felt something loosen in his chest. A direction forward, even if it led nowhere. "Thanks. Don't thank me yet. This might just be another dead end." Vernon paused. "But Walt, you should prepare yourself. You might not like what you find. Tommy stayed away for a reason. Sometimes those reasons are ones we'd rather not know." Walt nodded. He understood that. Had been wrestling with it since the beginning. But knowing was better than not knowing, even if the truth hurt. The sheriff's office was housed in the same building as the post office and town hall, a brick structure that had been there since the '30s. Julie Brennan was maybe 40, efficient and no-nonsense. She listened to Walt's request with a neutral expression. "You're looking for records from 1975. Around then, yes. Missing person reports. Any kind of investigation or inquiry involving Tom Hanley or the Peterson property. That's 50 years ago. Most of our records from that era are in storage, if they exist at all. We're not required to keep files that old. I understand. But if there's anything..." Julie held up a hand. "I'll look." "Can't promise I'll find anything, but I'll look. Give me a few days." Walt left his phone number and thanked her. It was something. Maybe not much, but something. 3 days later, Julie called. "I found something. You should come in." Walt drove to the office immediately. Julie led him to a back room where old filing boxes were stacked floor to ceiling. She'd pulled one down and had it open on a table. "November 1975, she said. "Jacob Peterson filed a missing person report for someone named Tom. No last name given. Male. Approximately 25 years old, 5'9", brown hair, brown eyes. Last seen at the Peterson Ranch on November 15th. Walt's heart was racing. "What else does it say?" "Not much." Herb Collins followed up. "Talked to some people around town. Nobody had seen Tom leave. No vehicles were reported missing. It was like he walked off the property and vanished." Herb noted that Tom was a transient worker and might have simply moved on. Case was closed as a voluntary departure after 2 weeks. "That's it?" "That's it." Julie paused. "There is one more thing." Tucked in the file, she pulled out a small piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a receipt from Greyhound bus lines, Copper Ridge to Seattle, dated November 16th, 1975. "One way." "Where did this come from?" Walt asked. "No note, no explanation. Someone must have found it and added it to the file. My guess is Herb tracked it down, confirmed Tom had left town, and closed the case. Walt stared at the receipt. Seattle. Tommy had gone to Seattle. It wasn't much, but it was a direction. A next step. Can I get a copy of this? I'll make you copies of everything in the file. Walt left the sheriff's office with a folder of papers and a destination. Seattle in 1975. Tommy would have been 25, alone, probably with almost no money and a head full of trauma. What had he been looking for there? What had he found? That night, Walt pulled out a map and traced the route from Montana to Seattle, nearly 700 miles. Tommy would have been on that bus for hours, watching the landscape change, heading towards something or running from something, or maybe both at once. Walt added the receipt to his growing collection of Tommy's artifacts. Each piece told part of the story, but the full picture remained maddeningly out of reach. He was closer than he'd been, but close didn't mean there. He called Michael Peterson again. "Did your sister ever mention Seattle? Did Tom ever talk about knowing anyone there?" "Not that I remember. But like I said, I was young. Sarah might have known more." Another dead end. But Walt wasn't giving up. Seattle was something. Seattle was a lead. And if Tommy had left a trail there, Walt would find it. He just had to figure out where to look. Walt was at the barn again, unable to stay away despite having searched every inch of it twice. Something kept pulling him back, a feeling that he'd missed something important. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years. They'd kept him alive through 2 decades of rodeo work. They were telling him now that the barn still had secrets. He was in the loft when he noticed it. A beam running along the north wall, about 8 feet up. The wood looked different there, newer somehow. Walt climbed his ladder and examined it more closely. Someone had replaced a section of the beam, matching it carefully to the old wood, but not perfectly. The nails were newer too, not the ancient iron spikes used in the original construction. Walt pulled out his crowbar and started working at the board. It came away easier than expected, revealing a hollow space behind. Inside was a metal box, the kind used for important documents. It was locked, but the lock was cheap. Walt forced it open with the crowbar. Inside was a stack of papers held together with a rubber band that crumbled when Walt touched it. He carried everything down to better light and spread the papers across a hay bale. The first document was a death certificate. Thomas James Hanley. Date of death, the 12th of March 2003. Place of death, Seattle, Washington. Cause, complications from pneumonia. Age at death, 53. Walt's hands went numb, 2003. Tommy had been alive until 2003. Their mother had died in August of that year, 5 months after Tommy. Both gone within months of each other, one knowing and one never knowing. He forced himself to keep reading. There were medical records. Tommy had been treated at a VA hospital in Seattle, starting in 1998. The diagnosis was extensive. Post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic depression, substance abuse issues in his 30s that he'd overcome by his 40s. The records showed years of therapy, medication adjustments, slow progress towards stability. But there was more, much more. A marriage certificate from 1982, Thomas Hanley and Jennifer Morse, married in Seattle. A birth certificate from 1984, daughter, Emma Marie Hanley. Another from 1987, son, Jacob Thomas Hanley. Named after Jacob Peterson, Walt realized. Walt sat down hard. Tommy had married, had children, had built a whole life in Seattle while Walt was in Copper Ridge, believing his brother was dead. There were photographs. Tommy with his wife, both smiling at the camera, Tommy holding a newborn baby. Tommy with 2 kids, maybe 5 and 8 years old, at what looked like a park. In every photo, Tommy looked older, more weathered, but also more at peace than in that barn photograph from the 70s. At the bottom of the stack was a letter. The envelope was addressed to Walt Hanley, Copper Ridge, Montana, but had never been mailed. The letter inside was dated January 2003, 2 months before Tommy died. Walt's vision blurred as he started reading. "Dear Walt, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to mail this. I've started it 100 times over the years and never gotten past the first few lines. But I'm sick now, and the doctors say I don't have much time. So maybe that's the push I need to finally tell you the truth. I came home from Vietnam in 1971. Not officially, I was still listed as missing, but I made it back. I was in bad shape. Physically, I was okay, but mentally I was broken in ways I didn't understand. I couldn't face you and Mom and Dad, couldn't let you see what I'd become, so I hid. Jacob Peterson found me sleeping in his barn, and instead of turning me away, he gave me a place to stay. No questions, no judgment. I lived with his family for 2 years, trying to put myself back together. They saved my life, Walt. I don't know how else to say it, but I couldn't stay. Every time I saw them being a family, it reminded me of what I'd given up. So I left. Went to Seattle because it was far away, and nobody knew me there. I thought I'd figure things out and then come home, but days turned into weeks, turned into years, and eventually it felt like I'd been gone too long. How do you tell people you love that you've been alive all along but just couldn't face them? I met Jennifer in 1980. She was a therapist, working with veterans. She saw past all my damage and somehow decided I was worth saving. We got married, had kids. I finally got help from the VA, started dealing with the things I'd been running from, built a life I never thought I'd have. And all that time, I thought about you, about Mom and Dad, about coming back, but I was a coward, Walt. I let years pass and convinced myself it was better this way, that you'd all moved on, that showing up after so long would cause more pain than it would fix. I was wrong. I know that now. But it's too late to fix it. There's one more thing you need to know. About 3 years ago, I went back to Copper Ridge. You were at the diner. I saw you through the window. You looked older but good, solid, like you'd figured out how to live your life right. I watched you for a while, working up the courage to go inside, but then I saw how peaceful everything seemed, and I couldn't do it, couldn't walk in and blow everything apart. I left these things in the barn because I needed someone to find them eventually, needed the truth to exist somewhere besides inside my head. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and maybe that's fitting. Maybe the dead can finally tell the truth when the living couldn't. I'm sorry, Walt. Sorry for all the years I stole from us. Sorry Mom and Dad never knew. Sorry I was too weak to be the brother you deserved. Tell my kids about Copper Ridge if you ever meet them. Tell them their father came from somewhere, had a family, was loved. They deserve to know that much at least. Your brother, Tommy. Walt read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd reading, he was crying openly, not bothering to wipe his face. Tommy had been here, had been in Copper Ridge 3 years ago, had seen Walt, had been close enough to touch. And then he'd walked away again, taking the truth with him. The anger Walt expected didn't come. Instead, he felt overwhelming sadness mixed with understanding. Tommy had been right about one thing: he'd been broken. And broken people don't always make good choices. They make the choices they can live with, even when those choices are wrong. But Tommy had left breadcrumbs, had hidden his story where someone might find it. That counted for something. It meant that some part of him had wanted to be found, wanted the truth to come out, even if he couldn't face it himself. Walt carefully gathered all the papers, all the photographs, all the evidence of Tommy's hidden life. His brother had been alive until 2003, had built a family, had found some measure of peace, and had died believing Walt would never know any of it. But Walt did know now, and he had a niece and nephew somewhere in Seattle who'd never met their uncle, who probably didn't even know Copper Ridge existed, who deserved to know they had family here if they wanted it. Walt's hands were shaking. As he pulled out his phone, he had work to do, calls to make, truths to tell. Tommy's story didn't have to end in silence and secrets. It could end with family coming home. Walt drove home from the barn in a daze, Tommy's letter on the passenger seat beside him. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple that Tommy would never see again, that their parents had never seen again. So much time lost, so many sunsets missed. At home, Walt spread everything across his dining room table: the death certificate, the marriage license, the birth certificates, the photographs, all the evidence of a life lived in secret. Emma Marie Hanley, born 1984. She'd be 41 now. Jacob Thomas Hanley, born 1987, 38. Both adults with lives of their own, possibly families. And neither of them had any idea their father had a brother in Montana who'd spent decades mourning him. The question was whether they'd want to know. Walt stared at his phone for an hour, before finally calling Vernon. He needed someone to tell him this wasn't crazy, or if it was crazy, that it was the right kind of crazy. Vernon arrived 20 minutes later with a six-pack of beer and the good sense not to ask questions until Walt was ready to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, and Walt handed him Tommy's letter without a word. Vernon read it slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something like grief. When he finished, he set it down carefully and took a long drink of his beer. Hell, Walt. Yeah, he was alive all that time, had kids, 2 of them, Emma and Jacob. They'd be in their late 30s now. Vernon was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about finding them? I have to, their family. They deserve to know about Tommy, about where he came from, about us. You think they'll want to hear from a stranger claiming to be their uncle? I don't know, but I have to try. Tommy asked me to. It's in the letter. Tell my kids about Copper Ridge, if you ever meet them. Those were his words. Vernon nodded slowly. All right. So how do you find them? That was the question Walt had been wrestling with. Emma and Jacob Hanley weren't exactly uncommon names. Seattle was a big city. They could be anywhere by now. Married with different last names, moved to different states. Finding them might be impossible, but Walt had to try. He started with the basics. Social media searches turned up dozens of Emma Hanleys and Jacob Hanleys, but none of the right age in the Seattle area. He tried the white pages, online directories, public records, databases. Nothing conclusive. Vernon suggested a private investigator, but Walt dismissed it. This was too personal, too important to hand off to a stranger. He needed to do this himself, needed to look Tommy's children in the eye when he told them their father had a family they'd never known about. It took 3 days of searching, cross-referencing, and following dead ends before Walt found her. Emma Hanley Morrison, a high school art teacher in Tacoma, just south of Seattle. Her school's website had a faculty page with photos. Walt knew her the moment he saw her picture. She had Tommy's eyes, the same thoughtful expression. The resemblance was unmistakable. Finding Jacob took longer. He joined the Navy after high school, served 8 years, and now worked as a maritime engineer in Portland. Walt found a LinkedIn profile that matched the age and location. The photo showed a man with their father's build and Tommy's face, another ghost made flesh. Walt sat with their information for 2 days, trying to figure out what to say. How do you call someone out of the blue and tell them their father had a whole family they never knew existed? How do you explain that you're their uncle, that their grandparents died never knowing they had grandchildren, that there's an entire history waiting for them if they want it? He wrote and rewrote emails, drafted and deleted text messages. Finally, Vernon told him to stop overthinking it and just call. The longer you wait, the harder it gets, Vernon said. Rip the bandage off. Walt called Emma first. His hands were shaking when he dialed. The phone rang 4 times, and he was about to hang up when a woman answered. Hello? Is this Emma Morrison? Emma Hanley Morrison? Yes. Who's this? Walt's throat was tight. My name is Walt Hanley. This is going to sound strange, but I believe I'm your uncle. Your father was my brother. Silence. Walt could hear background noise. Kids playing, a TV on somewhere. Normal life, about to be complicated. I don't have an uncle, Emma said carefully. My father didn't have siblings. He did. He had me. And our parents. But he never told you about us because Walt's voice caught. It's complicated. I found some things he left behind. Letters, photographs, a message for you and your brother. I know this is unexpected, but I'd like to talk to you. About him, about your family. My father died in 2003. I don't know who you are or what you want, but I know he died in March. I have his death certificate and his letter to me, where he asked me to tell you and Jacob about Copper Ridge if I ever found you. He wanted you to know where he came from. Another long silence. How do you know my brother's name? I have Jacob's birth certificate. And Emma, I have photographs of you as a child. Your father left them hidden in a barn in Montana, along with his whole history. Please, just give me a chance to explain. If you don't want to hear it after that, I'll leave you alone. But you deserve to know the truth about your father. He could hear her breathing, could almost feel her weighing the decision. Finally she spoke. I need to call my brother. If this is real, he should hear it too. Can you give me a number where I can reach you? Walt gave her his cell phone. Emma, I know this is hard to believe, but I'm telling the truth. Your father was a good man who made choices he thought were protecting the people he loved. He was wrong, but his intentions were never bad. I hope you'll give me a chance to tell you about him. I'll call you back. She hung up. Walt set the phone down and realized he was shaking. Vernon, who'd been listening from across the table, handed him a beer. That went better than it could have. She didn't believe me. She didn't hang up immediately. That's something. 2 hours later, Walt's phone rang. Emma again. I talked to my brother. We want to hear what you have to say, but we want proof. Something that shows you're who you claim to be. I can send you photographs. Your father's letter. His dog tags from the war. Birth certificates, marriage license, everything I found. But I'd rather do this in person if you're willing. You want us to come to Montana? I want you to see where your father grew up, meet the people who knew him, see the barn where he left all. These things for someone to find. If you come here, I can show you everything, help you understand why he made the choices he did. Emma was quiet. We'd need time. To arrange time off work, make travel plans. Take whatever time you need. I've waited 45 years to know the truth about my brother. I can wait a few more weeks for you. Okay. Her voice was softer now, less defensive. We'll figure something out. I'll call you. After they hung up, Walt sat at his table, surrounded by Tommy's artifacts, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Tommy had asked him to tell his children about Copper Ridge. Walt was going to do better than that. He was going to show them, give them the gift Tommy had never been able to give himself: a way home. Over the next week, Walt prepared. He cleaned his house, bought fresh sheets for the guest bedrooms he hadn't used in years. He made copies of all of Tommy's documents, organized them into folders. He took photographs of the barn, the carvings, everything that told Tommy's story. And he talked to people. Marlene at the diner, Vernon, even old Frank Jessup, who'd been around long enough to remember Tommy as a kid. Walt asked them to share their memories, to be ready to meet Tommy's children if they came. The town rallied. That was the thing about small places. When something mattered, people showed up. Marlene offered to cook a welcome dinner. Vernon organized a group to fix up the barn, make it safer for visitors. Helen at the library pulled out old yearbooks and photographs from the archives, anything that showed Tommy before the war. Walt even drove out to the cemetery and stood at Tommy's empty grave for the first time in years. The headstone read, Thomas James Hanley, 1950 to 1970, gone but not forgotten. You were forgotten, Walt said quietly. We all forgot you were still out there, still fighting. But Emma and Jacob remember. They loved you, and now they're going to know you came from somewhere, had people who cared about you. I'm going to make sure of that. 2 weeks after his first call with Emma, she called back. We're coming. Jacob and I. We'll fly into Billings next Friday, rent a car. We want to see it all. Walt's chest tightened with emotion he couldn't name. Thank you. You won't regret this. I hope not. My father never talked about his past. He always said it didn't matter, that family was about now, not then. But Jacob and I, we've always wondered, always felt like there was something missing in our history. There was. And I'm going to fill in every blank I can. After hanging up, Walt walked through his house and tried to see it through strangers' eyes. Through the eyes of Tommy's children, coming to meet an uncle they'd never known existed. It wasn't much, just a simple house in a dying town. But it was family, and sometimes that was enough. The day Emma and Jacob arrived was unseasonably warm for late November, the sky clear and blue in a dot, the way that felt like a blessing. Walt had been awake since 4, unable to sleep, checking and rechecking that everything was ready. The folders of documents were arranged on the dining room table. The house was clean. Coffee was made. He'd driven to Billings to meet them at the airport, wanting to show them the landscape as they approached Copper Ridge, to let them see what Tommy had seen when he'd come home from the war. The drive took 2 hours. Walt spent most of it silent, his mind too full of everything he wanted to say. They were waiting in the arrivals area when Walt walked in. He recognized them immediately. Emma was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, Tommy's eyes studying everything with careful attention. Jacob was broader, built like their father, but with Tommy's mouth and the same way of holding his shoulders that Walt remembered from 50 years ago. Walt stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. These were strangers, family by blood, but strangers by circumstance. What if they looked at him and saw nothing? What if the connection he felt so strongly didn't exist for them? Emma took the first step. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes searching his face. When she was close enough to touch, she stopped. "You have his hands," she said quietly. "My father's hands. I'd know them anywhere." Walt looked down at his own weathered, scarred hands. "We both got them from our father, your grandfather." "Jacob," Emma called over her shoulder. "It's him." Jacob approached more cautiously, but when he reached Walt, he extended his hand. "I'm Jacob Hanley. This is my sister, Emma." Walt shook his hand, felt the firm grip, the same calluses that came from working with tools. "I'm glad you came, both of you. I know this can't be easy." "We almost didn't," Jacob admitted. "Spent the whole flight arguing about whether this was real or some kind of scam. But Emma wanted to see where Dad came from, and I figured we'd come this far. Might as well finish it. I understand. Come on, let's get your bags and head to Copper Ridge. It's about 2 hours. I'll tell you what I know on the way." They loaded the rental car and started driving. Walt had offered to drive, wanting them to see the landscape without distraction. As they left Billings behind and headed into open country, he began to talk. He told them about Tommy as a boy, about how he'd carved animals from scrap wood, spent hours getting every detail perfect, about how he'd been the smart one, the gentle one, the one everyone thought would do something special with his life. He told them about the telegram in 1970, about the funeral for an empty casket, about 45 years of believing Tommy was dead. And then he told them about buying the barn, about finding the carvings and the letters and the dog tags, about the trail that led to Michael Peterson, to the library archives, to Tommy's letter written 2 months before he died. Emma was crying by the time Walt finished. Not sobbing, just quiet tears running down her face. Jacob stared out the window, his jaw tight. "He never told us," Emma said. "Never mentioned Montana or you or any of it. We thought he'd grown up in foster care, that he didn't have family. He said it was better not to talk about the past. He was protecting you," Walt said, "and protecting himself. The war broke something in him. He couldn't face coming home, couldn't let us see what he'd become. It was the wrong choice, but I understand why he made it." "Does anyone else know," Jacob asked, "about him being alive all those years?" "Just a few people. Vernon Mills, my closest friend. Marlene, at the diner, the librarian. I needed help putting the pieces together, but I haven't told the whole town. I wanted you to decide how public this should be." They drove through Copper Ridge's main street, past the closed buildings and the diner and the general store. Emma looked at everything with hungry eyes, trying to see what her father had seen. Walt pulled up to his house and turned off the engine. This was our parents' house. I inherited it after they died. Tommy grew up here, played in that yard, learned to ride in the barn out back. He turned to face them. I've got everything inside. His letters, his carvings, photographs, his dog tags from the war. But before we look at any of that, I want to give you something. He reached into the center console and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. He handed it to Emma. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was the wooden horse, the first carving Walt had found in the barn, the one that had started everything. Your father made this when he was maybe 12 years old, Walt said. It's been waiting a long time to come home. Emma held it in both hands, her fingers tracing the smooth wood, the detailed mane, the careful work of a boy who'd grown into a man neither of them had fully known. When she looked up at Walt, her eyes were full of questions and grief and something that looked like gratitude. They spent 2 hours in Walt's dining room, going through every document, every letter, every photograph. Emma read their grandmother's letters aloud, her voice breaking occasionally. Jacob held Tommy's dog tags, turning them over and over in his hands like a prayer. He kept all of this, Emma said. Every letter. He carried them back from Vietnam and held onto them for 30 years. He never forgot where he came from, Walt said. He just couldn't find his way back. Jacob set down the dog tags carefully. There's so much we didn't know about him. He was a good father, present, attentive, always there for us, but he had these moments where he'd go somewhere else in his head. We learned not to ask about it. The war never really ended for him, Walt said. That's what men of his generation carried. They came home, but part of them stayed in the jungle. Can we see the barn? Emma asked. Where you found everything? Walt drove them out to the Peterson property. The barn looked better than it had weeks ago. Vernon and a few others had patched the worst holes in the roof, cleared debris, made it safe to walk through. They'd even hung battery-powered lanterns so the space was properly lit. Walt led Emma and Jacob inside. They moved slowly, taking in every detail. The support beams where carvings had been hidden, the place where the floorboards had concealed Tommy's dog tags, the loft where the metal box had waited for 40 years to be discovered. He lived here, Emma said. It wasn't a question. The Petersons took him in, and this is where he stayed. For 2 years, Michael Peterson said Tommy helped with ranch work, kept to himself mostly, but he was part of their family. They cared about him. Jacob climbed up to the loft, careful on the reinforced ladder. He stood where Tommy must have stood, looking out at the Montana landscape through the broken boards. When he came back, down, his eyes were wet. I wish we'd known, he said. Wish we'd had a chance to meet you before Dad died. He talked about you in the letter. Said you looked good, peaceful, but he was too afraid to come in and talk to you. I wish I'd seen him, Walt said. Wish I'd looked up at the right moment and recognized my own brother looking through that diner window. But we can't change the past. We can only decide what to do with what's left. They were about to leave when Walt remembered, there's one more thing. The most important thing, maybe. He retrieved the carving from his truck, the one Jacob Peterson had sent him. The figures on the fence. He unwrapped it and showed it to Emma and Jacob. Your father made this before he left the Peterson place. It's me and him, the way we used to sit when we were boys. He carved it from memory. Gave it to Jacob Peterson as a thank you. Emma took the carving with trembling hands. It's beautiful. He never forgot. That's what this says. To me. He was broken and lost and far from home, but he remembered the good things, remembered what it felt like to be brothers. That evening, Marlene hosted a dinner at the closed diner. She'd invited Vernon, Helen from the library, Frank Jessup, and a handful of others who'd known Tommy as a boy. The diner was warm and full of food, and for 3 hours they told stories. Frank remembered Tommy helping his father fix a fence one summer, working hard despite being barely 14. Helen recalled Tommy winning an art prize in 8th grade for a drawing of horses. Vernon, who'd been 5 years behind Tommy in school, remembered seeing him at football games, cheering from the stands. Emma and Jacob listened to every word, collecting pieces of a father they'd known but never fully understood. These were the missing years, the childhood their father had never shared. Each story filled in another blank space. "He was a good kid," Frank said toward the end of the evening. "Quiet, thoughtful. The kind who'd stop to help if he saw someone struggling. The war took that kid away from us. But hearing about the man he became, the father he was to you two, that tells me some part of him survived, some part stayed good." Emma stood up, her glass of wine in hand. "I want to thank all of you for remembering my father, for helping us understand where he came from. Jacob and I, we've always felt like we only knew half of him. Now we know why. And while I wish he'd felt safe enough to tell us about you, about this place, I'm grateful we're here now." She looked at Walt. "Uncle Walt, if I can call you that, thank you for not giving up, for searching until you found us, for giving us this gift." Walt couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He just nodded. Later, as they walked back to Walt's house under a sky full of stars, Emma slipped her arm through his. "We'd like to stay a few more days, if that's all right. There's more we want to see, more we want to learn." "Stay as long as you want," Walt said. "Your family. This is your home too, whenever you need it." And for the first time in 45 years, Walt felt like Tommy had finally made it home. Emma and Jacob stayed for 5 days. In that time, they walked every inch of the town, visited the cemetery where their grandparents were buried, and spent hours at the barn that had held their father's secrets. Jacob, who worked with his hands for a living, examined Tommy's carvings with an engineer's eye and an artist's appreciation. Emma, the art teacher, photographed everything, creating a record for students and family alike. On their last full day, Emma made a suggestion. "We should add something. To the barn, I mean. Something that shows we were here, that we know his story now." They drove to the barn with wood and tools borrowed from Vernon. Jacob sketched out a design, a plaque, simple but meaningful. Emma did the lettering, her hand steady and sure. Walt provided the wood, a piece of Montana pine that matched the carvings Tommy had made decades before. Together, the three of them created it. A memorial that read, "Thomas James Hanley lived here, 1972 to 1975. Son, brother, father, never forgotten. Family endures." They mounted it on the main support beam, at eye level where anyone who entered would see it. Jacob stepped back, examining their work. He'd have liked this. Something permanent, something that says he mattered. He did matter, Walt said, to all of us. That evening, Vernon came over for dinner. Emma cooked, using recipes she'd learned from her mother Jennifer, who'd learned to make them from Tommy. They ate together around Walt's kitchen table, filling the house with conversation and laughter it hadn't held in years. "What will you do with the barn?" Emma asked. "Now that you know the full story?" Walt had been thinking about that question for days. "I'm not sure yet. Part of me wants to preserve it as it is, a kind of memorial. But that feels like trapping Tommy in his pain. He'd want it to be something useful, something alive. A workshop, maybe," Jacob suggested. "Someplace where people could learn woodworking, keep his craft going. Or an artist's studio," Emma added. "Copper Ridge could use more art, more beauty." Vernon, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "What if it was both? A community space. Woodworking, art classes, whatever people wanted to learn. You could call it the Hanley Workshop. Honor Tommy, and your parents both." Walt felt something settle in his chest. That was right. That honored who Tommy had been and who he'd tried to become. "I like that. The Hanley Workshop. A place for making things, for learning." Tommy would have approved. They talked late into the night, making plans, dreaming bigger than any of them had dreamed in years. Vernon knew contractors who could help with renovations. Emma could develop a curriculum, maybe teach there during summers. Jacob promised to help with the structural work, make sure the building was sound. It wouldn't happen overnight. Projects like this took time, money, effort, but Walt had all three now. He had purpose again, and family to share it with. The next morning, Walt drove Emma and Jacob back to Billings. The drive was quieter than the trip out had been, full of comfortable silence and occasional observations about the landscape. At the airport, Emma hugged Walt hard enough to crack ribs. "We'll be back," she said. "For Christmas, if you'll have us. I want my kids to meet their great-uncle. Want them to know about their grandfather and this place. You're always welcome," Walt said. "All of you. This is your home, too." Jacob shook his hand, then pulled him into a brief hug. "Thank you for finding us, for not letting Dad's story end in silence. Thank you for coming, for giving an old man a reason to hope again." He watched them walk through security, waving until they disappeared from sight. Then he drove home, to Copper Ridge, to a house that felt less empty than it had in decades. The weeks that followed were busy. Walt started the paperwork to establish the Hanley Workshop as a non-profit. Vernon helped organize fundraisers. Marlene spread the word through her network, and donations started trickling in. People who'd known Tommy, people who'd known their parents, people who just believed in giving Copper Ridge something to hope for. By Christmas, the barn had a new roof and reinforced walls. Emma and Jacob came back as promised, bringing Emma's husband and their 2 children, Jacob's wife and his daughter. The house was full of family for the first time since Walt's parents had died. On Christmas Eve, they all walked to the barn. Snow had fallen the night before, covering everything in white. Inside, they'd set up a small tree and hung lights. The children played while the adults stood together, looking at the plaque they'd made. Emma's daughter, age 9, and named Sarah after her great-grandmother, asked Walt to tell her about Tommy. Walt knelt down, pulled out one of the wooden carvings, a dog, smooth and perfect, and began to talk. He told her about a boy who loved to make beautiful things, who went to war and came back broken, who found kindness from strangers and eventually built a family of his own. He was brave, Walt said, not in the way people usually mean. He was brave enough to keep going when everything hurt, brave enough to love again when he thought he couldn't, and brave enough to leave clues so that someday someone would find him and know his story. Sarah took the carving carefully in both hands. "Will you teach me to make things like this?" Walt looked at Emma, who nodded with tears in her eyes. "I'd be honored. Your great-grandpa would be too." As the family gathered around the tree, singing carols and telling stories, Walt felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Peace, not the peace of forgetting or accepting loss, but the peace of understanding, of knowing that even broken things could be mended, even lost things could be found, and that family, real family, endured through time and silence and all the wounds people carried. Tommy had made it home after all, not in body, but in memory and blood and the hands of children who'd carry his craft forward. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. Outside, snow continued to fall on Copper Ridge, covering the old town in white. And in the barn, where Tommy had hidden his past, his family celebrated his future, proving that the hardest journey anyone can take is the one that finally brings them home.